Hello and welcome to today's lecture on post-war Pacific Northwest or post-war Washington. So in today's lecture, we'll be talking about Washington State history after World War II. So this is the first of two lectures on this particular subject. Before we get going, I just want to draw your attention to something, which is that one of the running themes of this particular class is that life in Washington and the greater Pacific Northwest has always been impacted by world events, whether it was the age of European exploration, the age of European and American imperialism, whether it was industrialization, the global economy, or whether it was the world wars. Washington has been intimately connected to events happening around the world. As much as any state in this country, maybe even more than the vast majority of states in this country. That will continue in the post-war era. What this means is that it's very difficult to understand Washington State history without some greater concept of what is going on in the world and what is going on in the rest of this country. So in these next two lectures, what I will be doing is framing events that happen in this country or the rest of the world, and in explaining how they have impact and significance within the context of Washington State history. Now, there won't be a full explanation of these events or these movements or these ideas, just enough for you to have the context to understand the expression in this region, okay? So with that in mind, let's start with what's known as the Cold War. So during World War II, the United States had fought a two-front war against Nazi Germany, so fascist Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan in the Pacific. So a two-front war, European theater and a Pacific theater. That's what the United States had done. It fought that two-front conflict. In the middle of that conflict, the United States decided that its interests after World War II did not line up with one of its major allies during the war, and that was the Soviet Union, at the time led by Joseph Stalin. So the Soviet Union was a communist country, and if you want to know more about the Soviet Union, you can take a modern world history class or a modern Western civilizations class, and we have both those. We have those classes on this campus, and you can talk about the Soviet Union to your heart's delight or to whatever satisfies your interest level. We're not going to do that here, but for the purpose of this conversation, what you need to know is that the Soviet Union and the United States were uneasy allies. They had a common enemy in Nazi Germany. And as a result of that common enemy, they negotiated an arrangement with one another so the Soviets would participate in the Pacific theater to a certain extent and would participate beyond the defeat of Nazi Germany. But it was an uneasy alliance. And the United States and the Soviet Union, as it became obvious by 1943 that the Allies were going to defeat, the Axis powers. They were going to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and Imperial Japan. By 1943, the question of victory was really not if, it was a matter of when. As those things were starting to occur, the Soviets and the Americans began to look to what the post-World War II world would look like. A world in which there would be crumbling European empires, a world in which there would be a need for industrial resources and for fossil fuels, a world in which there was going to be intense military power possessed by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and they became rivals. That rivalry did not stop them from partnering through World War II, but once the war was over, the rivalry became quite intense. And this is the start of what journalists and scholars and historians and politicians call the Cold War. The Cold War refers to a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. And it's called the Cold War because it takes place from 1945, the end of World War II, to 1989/1991. 89 is when what's called the Iron Curtain falls in Eastern Europe. So all of the Soviet allied states, or satellites as they were known in Eastern Europe, overthrow Soviet-backed communist governments, and the Soviets let them go. And then 1991 is when the Soviet Union officially is dissolved in Russia, and communism is thrown away in Russia. So between 1945 and 1989/1991, there was an intense rivalry across the world between the Soviet Union and its allies, and the United States and its allies. Now, it's called the Cold War because the United States and Soviet Union never fought directly against one another. There's never a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. What there was intense military buildup. We'll talk more about this in a bit. But it was an intense military buildup, right? An intense military buildup in which both the Soviet Union and the United States will spend billions upon billions of dollars to maintain and upgrade and expand their military capabilities. Size of the army in terms of troops and soldiers, the equipment, ordnance, weapons, so on and so forth, right? There's an intense military buildup, right? A military expansion on behalf of both the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies. There's also a tremendous espionage rivalry. If you're familiar with a lot of pop culture from the time period, like the James Bond films, the Cold War looms behind all of those sort of James Bond novels and films, or John le Carré, who's a famous British espionage novel writer. You know, the Cold War is considered sort of the real birth of espionage in the modern world. The CIA is established in the United States. The Soviet Union has its KGB, and there's this massive espionage effort across the globe to infiltrate, to gather intelligence and secrets, or to influence decisions of political and economic leaders. There's a whole host of things that goes on with respect to espionage. There's also a foreign policy rivalry in which the United States and the Soviet Union are trying to get as many allies as possible in strategic places around the world. This is particularly acute because after World War II, European empires crumble. And Europeans had vast empires in Africa and in Asia. And suddenly these places are finding themselves after World War II, between the 1940s and the 1950s and 60s, gaining independence. It doesn't just happen at once. It's a gradual process. But as it occurs, right, there's an intense rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States over trying to get allies in these newly independent countries. And this creates all sorts of diplomatic pressure, espionage pressure, economic incentives, corruption, all sorts of things in this scramble. There's also a nuclear side of this, because in 1950, the Soviet Union gets the atomic bomb. In 1945, the United States was the only nuclear country in the world. They're the only ones who had the bomb. But by 1950, the Soviets have it, and now suddenly you have a nuclear buildup, an arms race. Some of it traditional arms, like just traditional weapons and ordnance and so on and so forth. But a lot of it is first atomic bombs. And then later, when they develop missile technology, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, to carry nuclear warheads across oceans and continents. So there's an arms race around nuclear material. There's also a series of what politicians and scholars call proxy wars. I'm not a fan of this term. There's lots of people who aren't fans of this term because it sounds benign, but these wars were really awful. Okay, but they're called proxy wars, and what they are is it's a war in which either the United States or the Soviet Union or its allies are fighting a war against someone that's not the Soviets or not the United States, but the other side has an interest in the outcome and supports the enemy. Korea, Vietnam, they're examples of proxy wars. Ostensibly, in both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, the United States was fighting the invasion in Korea. It was the invasion of South Korea, which by North Korea, which was a communist country. And so the United States, along with its allies, fought to liberate South Korea. Okay? They're not fighting the Soviets, but they're fighting quote unquote communism. And communist China, and to a certain extent, Soviet Russia, are providing assistance to the North Koreans. So it's not a direct conflict, but it's a proxy for the Cold War conflict. Same thing in Vietnam, right? The United States is protecting South Vietnam, or it says it is trying to protect South Vietnam from communist North Vietnam. Those conflicts are intimately more complicated than that. But those are the rhetorics that are used to justify fighting those wars. Those are examples of proxy wars. The Soviets' most famous proxy war was in Afghanistan, where the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and the United States provided assistance to those opposing the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, right? The idea is this is a proxy for the Cold War, but the two sides are not going directly into conflict with one another. So that's the Cold War, and the United States is determined to fight it. Now, the first president who undertakes this policy is President Harry Truman. He's president of the United States at the time that the World War II ends and at the start of the Cold War. He's a Democrat. But Republicans and Democrats alike are committed to fighting the Cold War. In fact, what you often see in presidential politics during the Cold War era is the two political parties are trying to, outmatch one another in their anti-communist rhetoric. And so, whereas today in our modern politics, we often think of presidents having vastly different foreign policy goals from the next, right? President Obama's foreign policy goals were vastly different in many ways from his predecessor, President Bush. And Donald Trump's policies were vastly different from President Obama's, and President Biden's policies have been quite different in many ways than Donald Trump's policies. And that's just been a feature of our presidential politics with respect to foreign policy for the last couple decades, is that often predecessors reverse course on the foreign policy decisions or foreign policy platform of their predecessor. This was not an enormous feature of the Cold War in the sense that both political parties were committed to opposing the Soviets. They had different views of how that should be done, but they all saw themselves as Cold Warriors. And so regardless of who's in power, this is going to be the policy of the presidency. And so Truman begins this policy. He begins this military buildup. He begins this expansion of our atomic/nuclear capabilities. He commits the United States to maintaining a standing army the size necessary to fight a two-front war. So unlike previous wars and conflicts in which the United States built up a military, and then once the war was done, they downsized to a small force, the United States isn't going to do that after World War II. They're going to maintain the ability to fight a war like World War II, a two-front war, combined with expanded nuclear capabilities. That is going to be the commitment after the war. That is going to have consequences for the state of Washington. Because if you recall in previous lectures, we talked about how Washington is the source of important war industries. We have a shipbuilding industry in Washington. Well, if you're going to maintain a large navy, you're going to need to repair and maintain those ships. The Air Force, which at this time is not its own branch of the military, but will be after World War II, is dependent on airplane production. Well, Washington is the home to the Boeing Airplane Company, and therefore Washington's economy is going to benefit from the decision to maintain this size of the military through airplane production. Washington has one of the key nuclear facilities in the country, Hanford, so it's going to be strategically important. And so what you have, and also you have lots of military bases that were created in Washington as a consequence of World War II. Those are largely going to be maintained, and new ones are going to be built. So as a consequence, Washington's economy will be deeply impacted. Its citizens will be deeply impacted by the decision to continue the size and scope of the military, by the Cold War policies. Also, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit later, but I did mention proxy wars a little bit earlier. Two of the most famous proxy conflicts that the United States was involved in after World War II was the Korean War, right, 1950s, and the Vietnam War, right, officially 1964 to 1973, but the United States was involved in Vietnam long before 1964. And so what we have here is two large military operations, two large wars that the United States can be involved in, all take place on the other side of the Pacific, which makes Washington one of the most important staging grounds militarily for these conflicts. Washington is going to feel the impact of the Cold War. Washington's also going to feel the impact of the Cold War socially, and we need to have a conversation about that social ramifications, that social aspect of it. In order to fight any conflict, the government has to convince its citizens that that conflict is worth waging, that conflict is worth fighting. Think about what we've talked about with respect to World War I and World War II. The sacrifices that people were asked to make for that war, whether it was the draft or rationing of civilian goods so that those goods could go to the war effort, the mobilization of the economy, which resulted in a lack of production of consumer activity or of consumer items, tax money that could be spent on social programs like healthcare and education now going to military matters. There's a lot of sacrifices, great and small, that Americans are asked to make to fight wars. And that requires convincing Americans that the war is necessary to fight. Oftentimes that convincing wades into propaganda. Sophisticated advertising campaigns designed to generate popular support for military policies. I want you to understand something, because this is really important for the Cold War. Before World War II, the United States was mired in a Great Depression. Now, the United States wasn't the only place. The Great Depression impacted countries all over the world. But it began in the United States, and it was particularly acute in the United States, starting in 1929. So 1929 through 1941, when America officially enters the war, for 12 years, many Americans were suffering through real economic hardships. Unemployment, homelessness, food insecurity, social dislocation, because they've been forced to move all over the country looking for jobs, general poverty. And then beginning in 1940, when America ramps up economic production to support Britain and its allies before the United States entered World War II, the economy starts to turn around. And in World War II itself, the massive mobilization of the economy, the massive money spent by the government to conduct the war, that ends the Depression. It puts people to work. But the problem is, during the Great Depression, people couldn't afford goods. They couldn't afford goods. They just couldn't, because they didn't have money. Now, they have money. The war has solved the economic issue. There's money being made by people. But they can't buy anything because of rationing and the mobilization of the economy for the war. And World War II was the largest conflict the United States has ever been involved in. And there were lots of casualties and deaths from that war. And so by 1945, many Americans are looking forward to peacetime, to not having to worry about family in Europe or Asia, or loved ones serving in the military, and they're looking forward to just the return to normal life, nice, good paying jobs, being able to afford the basic necessities of life, raising their families, and so on and so forth. The problem is the United States is going to be committed to fighting a war against the Soviet Union. And that war is going to require a continued mobilization of the economy in some way. It's going to require shifting public opinion from the Soviets as our allies to the Soviets as our enemies. The draft is going to continue. Most people think of the draft as something that happened during World War I and World War II, and then they think about it again with Vietnam, the military draft, where young men over the age of 18 were drafted into the military. But the draft continued all from the start of World War II all the way until the Vietnam era. It didn't stop. So as a consequence, the draft is going to continue. Young men are going to continue to be drafted into the military. There's a whole host of sacrifices that the United States is going to ask people to continue to make to fight the Cold War. That means you got to convince them that the Soviets, who are our allies during the war, now are our enemies in this new era. So there's a whole bunch of propaganda that begins to emerge in order to convince Americans to fight this conflict. And that propaganda results in a new Red Scare. Remember, the first Red Scare was after World War I, a fear of communists and socialists and their sympathizers. Well, this new Red Scare post-World War II is much larger and much more famous in American history. It's also a Red Scare that was much more politically useful to certain politicians. By 1945, the Republican Party had been out of the White House since 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in. And they had not had much power in Congress either. On a national level, Democrats had dominated the politics of national politics through the Depression and World War II. And now, with a Democratic president leading the country as the United States celebrated the end of World War II, it looked very much like you might end up with another cycle of Democrats dominating national politics. And Republicans needed an issue. They needed an issue to convince voters to come their way. They needed an issue to convince voters to choose Republicans over Democrats. And you have to keep in mind, they couldn't use the Depression because it's over, and a Democrat was in charge when it ended. Now, that's not me saying that Democrats deserve credit for the end of the Great Depression. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that from a public perception policy, Roosevelt and now Truman were in charge and the Depression is over. World War II has been won, and Roosevelt led the war, and Truman picked up after Roosevelt died, and now Truman is the one taking the victory laps over the end of the war. And now Truman is talking about a new enemy that needs to be fought, the Soviets. Republicans need an issue that they can win on, and they see it in this new Red Scare. Because going back to the progressive era, all throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Democrats have been accused of being too aligned with socialist and communist groups. And many of those groups were in unions, and unions were the allies of the Democratic Party for the most part. And so what the Republican Party decides to do, now it's not just the Republicans, Democrats participate in the Red Scare. I want to make that clear. But many of the most famous leaders of national political movements during the Red Scare, the anti-communist leaders, they were Republicans, like Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, or Richard Nixon, a member of Congress from California. So many of the most important anti-communist Red Scare leaders in the country were Republicans. looking to make this an issue to seize the national political momentum from Democrats. And so what you had is that socialist and communist groups, or groups that could be painted as socialists and communists, suddenly found themselves under attack in America. That meant unions. That meant, political activists. That often meant civil rights activists. All these people were looked at as not just people with political agendas, but potential traitors and subversives in America. And then in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, in a famous speech, says that there are 200 communists who have infiltrated the State Department, and he has a list of them. That the Soviets are actually pulling the strings behind our government. Now, McCarthy makes this announcement, but he never shares his list. But it becomes such a potent political force in our politics that McCarthy gets this special committee in the Senate in which he gets to pull people before, and TV, which is a new medium, television, which is a new medium, is now filming these committee hearings in which McCarthy is grilling people about their political allegiances and accusing them of being Soviet spies. And it leads to this national hysteria over the infiltration of communists in the country, of Soviet spies and their allies in the country. It's known as McCarthyism. And you end up with McCarthy's hearings in the Senate. In the House, you get the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, this committee actually dates to World War II. They were investigating groups that were supporting the Nazis during the war. But what happens is Republicans turn this committee in Congress into a committee that looks at communists and socialists and groups that are allied with the Democratic Party. And this doesn't just happen at the national level, it happens at the state level. In places like Washington, where because of the war industries, many unions are going to want raises and to go on strike, union leaders are targeted. Union members are targeted by local groups, by local politicians as potential Soviet spies. The Washington State Legislature creates its own House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate, individuals who are supposedly communist spies living in the state of Washington. The most famous example of this is in 1947, when, due to the investigations of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the University of Washington is forced to purge many of its faculty who have socialist and communist sympathies or belong to socialist and communist political parties. Keep in mind, we have this little thing called the First Amendment, which not just guarantees you free speech, it guarantees you what's called free association. You have the right to assemble in groups. So this is a clear violation of the First Amendment, but it doesn't stop faculty from being purged, and the faculty who remain are all forced to sign loyalty oaths. Loyalty oaths that dictate what they can and cannot talk about in the classroom. And particularly this is with respect to socialism and communism and Marxism and so on and so forth. So what we have is a society, that is becoming paranoid, and a political party, and to be fair, there were Democratic politicians who did this as well, but the most famous leaders of this were Republicans. We had a political party looking to use this issue for its own political gain at the expense of groups and individuals. Now, the Red Scare was not the only social issue to emerge in Washington, United States after the war. So during World War II, one of the major ways that the United States had been promoting its and selling the war to the American public had been to say that it was a fight for freedom, to liberate those who were oppressed in Europe or in Asia. And it wasn't hard to make that case. The fascists in Nazi Germany and in Italy were truly totalitarian. And the most famous example of this, the Holocaust, doesn't need to, I mean, just the word Holocaust indicates the attempt to eliminate the Jewish people from Europe, right? That level of atrocity, that level of horror, that genocide is prime example of the kind of oppression and barbarism that the United States was saying it was opposing, it was fighting. But there are lots of other examples of Nazi barbarism. The Holocaust is just the absolute, without question, worst. But there were other examples of barbarism. And Imperial Japan committed tremendous war crimes in places like China during the war. So it was easy to make the case that you were fighting for freedom and to liberate people who were oppressed. That same rhetoric was then applied to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that we were fighting for liberating people from Soviet tyranny, from Soviet oppression. The problem was that such rhetoric assumes that the United States was a place free from oppression and in which freedom was guaranteed to all in this country. And of course, we know that that wasn't true. That tremendous racism and oppression existed in this country. That much of the country was impacted by segregation. In the American South, African Americans lived under the tyranny of Jim Crow laws that allowed for the brutality of black men and women without legal consequence, rape and murder and beatings with no legal consequence, which denied black people their constitutional right to vote, denied them equal access to education and jobs and housing, and created all sorts of inferior infrastructure for black communities and families and individuals within the South. But outside the South, due to covenants and racist local laws, lots of communities of color faced discrimination and prejudice. Remember the covenant system in Washington, which created segregated communities for people of Asian heritage, people of black heritage, people of Latinx heritage. So there was oppression and discrimination in the United States. And so a question was asked by many civil rights activists in these oppressed communities in the United States. Why do we spend so much money and blood and sweat and tears fighting for freedom abroad when we don't have freedom at home? And so what we begin to have is that the World War II and the Cold War begin to give a renewed push to civil rights efforts. And what happens is that civil rights activists find the courts are starting to be on their side. And in the late 1940s, the courts begin to make rulings that call illegal or unconstitutional many aspects of segregation. Most famously for Washington, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that the covenants were unconstitutional. And therefore, the major way that segregation was created in the United States, or excuse me, in Washington, was unconstitutional. Now, covenants actually don't get eliminated fully in Washington until 1968, despite them being unconstitutional. But it's a step in the direction. Also, by 1948, Harry Truman has decided to integrate the military. The military was segregated to appease Southern politicians and because so many military bases were in the American South. But Truman realized that this was logistically just not tenable. And he also didn't believe it was right. So Truman integrated the military. And thus, one of the largest parts of the American government, the United States military, was fully integrated by 1948. Segregation was eliminated. So we can start to see the steps happening. In addition to racial tensions and issues and civil rights around issues of race and identity, there was a new wave of feminism that gained momentum, a new wave of feminist activism around gender equality and women's rights that began to emerge after the war. And ironically, it was spurred by the war itself. So during World War II, because so many men were serving in the military, women were recruited and encouraged to enter the workforce to work in war industries. Most famously, right, the Rosie the Riveter ad campaign, in which they had this an image of a woman saying, "We can do this," or "We can do it," as she's holding a riveting gun for riveting the rivets that hold together the steel or aluminum panels for airplanes or ships. Well, women worked all sorts of war industries and industries that supported the war during World War II. And in doing so, they earned paychecks for the first time, good paychecks. They earned a degree of freedom and autonomy over their lives that many women had never enjoyed before. And then after the war, there was a encouragement by the U.S. government, encouraged businesses to let these women go as employees and give their jobs to men, particularly men returning from war. And women were pushed back into the home in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Many women resented this. And that gave momentum to a new wave of feminism, what we call second wave feminism. First wave feminism was about getting the right to vote and political rights. Second wave feminism is about greater educational, economic, and social equality. It's about pushing for those things. And this movement now has a lot more momentum than it did before the war, and it has a whole host of people who resent the way they were treated after the war. There's also a population boom in the United States, and especially in Washington after the war. This is called the baby boom, in which a whole host of children were born in the years after the war. And this baby boom results in the need for more housing. This new housing boom coincides with the widespread availability of automobiles. So now we get one of the most interesting demographic changes in America, the suburb. The suburb being the city or the small town or housing communities that are outside an urban center, like a Seattle. But the people who live in those suburbs often work in the city, so they have to commute in. So with the development of automobiles, you have the potential to live outside the city but commute in. But that then required roads. And there's a whole host of investment in roads because of this new demographic development. Now, in terms of the post-war economy, we just want to think about a few ways in which this is going to have a tremendous impact on Washington. As you might expect, Washington's economy is going to boom in the years after World War II because we have so many war industries here and so many military installations here. So the decision to fight the Cold War is going to result in lots of money being spent in the state of Washington and therefore generating a lot of jobs. But that's not to suggest the post-World War II period was without its economic hardships, because the federal government, particularly the Federal Reserve System and the Treasury Department, had to figure out a way to manage all the pent-up consumer demand for goods after the war, while also managing the mobilization of certain industries for the Cold War. And this resulted in a lot of economic pain and discontent in the country in the years after World War II, particularly between 1945 and 1950. And there were lots of strikes across the country by unions who were hoping to get better wages in the face of mounting work because of the Cold War. groups who were upset that the economy hadn't been repositioned to produce more consumer goods when there was a desire for consumer goods, whether it was automobiles or cars or electronics or all sorts of things for the housing. For housing, that stuff wasn't being released enough on purpose because they didn't want to cause inflation, but they were managing this sort of slowdown of the economy that frustrated people. So you really see a much more interventionist Federal Reserve banking system after the war because they're trying to manage the economy in a way that doesn't cause hyperinflation and ultimately economic hardship. Eventually, though, the economy begins to settle. And due to the Cold War, the United States decides to invest in a whole host of infrastructure projects to better support the war effort and to create a robust American economy. In Washington, these infrastructure projects will be critically important. And so we need to talk about two of them. The first is that the investment in dams on the Columbia River had been tremendously successful during the war. Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam had been key to the war effort because their electricity provided the power to many of the war industries in the region. And it was decided that since Washington was going to be an important state for the Cold War, that there was going to be expansion of Boeing and an expansion of the aluminum industry to support Boeing, all of which required more power. And so they began to invest in dams on the Columbia River. This started during the Eisenhower administration, and it continued well into the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. So it's called the Bonneville Power creation of the Bonneville Power Administration and the Columbia Basin Irrigation and Reclamation Project, and happened between 1953 and 1968. And that's in which they built a series of dams on the Columbia River and its tributaries for hydroelectricity. Now, what happens is the federal government provides most of the funding for these dams, but then they turn it over to local PUDs, local public utility districts, who manage the power on behalf of the people, and thus can keep rates low compared to private power across the country. But they are regulated by a whole series of federal laws, and there's an oversight by the Bonneville Power Administration, which is a federal agency. Now, there's also a byproduct to the dams, because dams create these massive reservoirs in order to generate hydroelectricity. Those reservoirs could be used, that water in those reservoirs could be used for other things. And that created the Columbia Basin Irrigation and Reclamation Project, which was basically taking the water from these dams and delivering it through irrigation canals to eastern Washington to irrigate fertile land that could not be utilized because of lack of water. They couldn't grow anything on it because they didn't have water, but if they had water, the land was fertile and could grow all sorts of things. And that Columbia Basin Irrigation and Reclamation Project continues to exist today and continues to expand today. If you were to drive all across eastern Washington, much of the land here benefits from those projects. And if you would have traveled this land prior to the 1950s, you wouldn't have seen nearly the kind of farming that you see today. You certainly would not have seen things like potatoes and onions and the kinds of things that require irrigation. You would have seen dryland wheat or free-range livestock. But other kinds of farming that require, vegetables and grains that require intense amounts of water, you never would have seen it before the reclamation project in certain areas of eastern Washington. This was a byproduct of investing in dams for the Cold War. Similarly, the transportation system in the United States, and especially in Washington, gets an upgrade. Eisenhower, during World War II, President Eisenhower had been in charge of the American forces and Allied forces in Europe during World War II. And he had been an admirer of the road system in Germany for moving troops and military goods. And he wanted to create a similar system in the United States. So he created the interstate high. He worked with Congress to create the Interstate Highway Project, which created a series of interstate highways for moving primarily military goods should they be necessary. But the real boon has been commercial and civilian traffic on those. And of course, Washington's going to benefit enormously from the interstate projects that connect this state to other parts of the country. So there's your first look at the years and decade or so after World War II. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the 50s, 60s, and beyond. All right, I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.